has a very specific topic really around tackling back to school anxiety, and people will know, even on the news this morning there's been renewed conversations about, you know, will all young people be able to go back to school in September. That is the intention of the government, but clearly there is worries about the second spike. And in the here and now, you know, what do we do? How do we do that? How do we support ourselves? How do we support parents? Because actually there's also the threat of redundancy for lots of families as you know, measures put in to support families, furlough schemes reduce in their coverage. So that's one bit, a specific topic. The other bit that we're doing is inviting Joe into our conversation with us, because what we want to make sure is that we have a conversation, but this isn't just about statutory agencies like health or local authority. It is also about our voluntary sector partners and all of us working together, because we all support young people. So with that in mind, just to say, I work as a consultant psychiatrist mainly in children's services, also a bit in our adult services in Surrey and Borders, and I spend most of my time helping co-lead our children and young people services in Surrey and Borders. I'll introduce you to Kathryn, who will say something about herself, and then Kathryn will introduce to Joe, and then we'll start our conversations over the next 45-50 minutes. Kathryn.
So yes, hello everybody. Welcome back those who have joined us before, and those that I've met before, and a big welcome to those who are here for the first time. My name is Kathryn Hollins, and I'm a consultant parent, child and family psychiatrist and psychotherapist. And I'm quite new to SABP and Surrey, and I have a particular role to connect in with systems across Surrey, so how we really work together across health, voluntary sector, and all of the different organisations, education, local authority, and all of the different people who work for families and children from the very beginning of life onwards. And we're really looking forward to thinking with you today and sharing our thoughts with you and to hear yours. I'm going to introduce Joe Cooks in just a moment, but first I just wanted to let you know something of who is on this call. So we have a list of all the different roles that you have, and I think the reason I want to share that with you is so that we remember in this weird digital world that we've created this small community for this hour of people who are all here for the same purpose. And that there are many ways that during meetings like this and outside it, we can support each other with this task. So we have inclusion officers, foster carers, counsellors, teaching assistants, head teachers, youth workers, ELSAs, paediatricians, directors of children's services in Surrey, OTs, physios, school nurses, commissioners, primary mental health workers, educational psychologists, pastoral leads, teachers, family centre outreach workers, chaplains, SENCOs, speech therapists, GPs, pharmacists, and more. I haven't mentioned all. So we're really all very much sharing this time together and thinking about anxiety. So let me pass over to Joe. And Joe, I wonder, you're not on my screen. So is she on your screen, Phil? Joe, I can't hear you. You're on mute, Phil.
Oh, she's not on my screen either.
Okay, Joe, can you come up yourself, Joe? Are you there?
I can try. I can. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I don't know if I speak that maybe.
Oh yes, there you are. Brilliant. So let me pass over to you, Joe. And we've been working together in the letter that first set off this process has various resources, and in a sense, of course, this meeting is partly to share resources with you, but in a way, those resources are there in the letter for you to look at. We can share those again. We wanted to use this webinar to really talk and have a conversation with you rather than just talk about the things out there. But the reason that Joe and I have a particular connection right now is through Surrey Wellbeing Partnership and the parent postings that I've been doing with Surrey Wellbeing Partnership and with Joe from Surrey Youth Focus. And we've been doing this as an offer, again, another experiment around using digital to reach out to parents around different accessible messages to support families in lockdown, which you're very welcome to have a look and access. So over to you, Jo, perhaps to introduce yourself and maybe to share something of what you've been finding out about the kind of anxieties that children and young people actually have.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kathryn. Hi, everybody. As Kathryn and Phil said, my name's Jo Cooks. I'm a collaboration manager at a very small charity based in Surrey called Surrey Youth Focus. We, as an organisation, collaborate and connect across the system, so local authorities, health, wider voluntary sector, community groups, to improve lives of children and young people and families here in Surrey. And we do a lot of work, as I say, collaborating and connecting and seeing what we can do to try and help make things work better across Surrey. I haven't been in Surrey Youth Focus for very long, just since Christmas, but I've lived and worked in Surrey with the voluntary sector and central government for many years, so I know it well. But part of my role, I've had the privilege of working with Kathryn on the Facebook page, but we've also having ears and listening to our colleagues in health and in schools and in the wider voluntary sector during COVID, have really realised that what is going on for children and young people at the moment and families. And so we've done some work, which I think we'll allude to later, listening to children and young people and parents, particularly of children with SEND, about their experiences of lockdown. What have they enjoyed? What have they found really hard? What are they looking forward to? And what are they worried about going forwards? So I don't know whether now is appropriate to share my slide or whether we want to do that later. Jo, is it possible to
Yeah, why not? Great.
share my slide? Is that okay? Which will just give you a flavour of what some of what our young people and children are saying at the moment. I don't know whether Jo's able to do that. But we've listened to 200 approximately children and young people across Surrey, and thanks to colleagues in health and the voluntary sector and our local authorities across in Surrey County Council for asking these questions. We don't work directly with children and young people. We're relying on other people to do this work for us. So it's a real partnership effort to have done that. But I've had the privilege of just reading what everybody's written and compiling it into a report. So this is just a real snapshot of what some of our young people and children are saying. We've spoken to children from under 10 through to 19 plus, and so they're really young people. Um, and they're worried about going back to school, as we can imagine. They're worried about transition if they're going to a new school, but they're also really worried if they're transitioning just between years as well, particularly for the younger children, where they're going to have a new teacher, a different classroom, and that's a really big thing because they've all missed their moving up day, which every child in Surrey does. So they haven't had that moving up day, so they really don't know who their teacher's going to be, and so they're really worried about that. And obviously, those who are going to new schools, particularly for year 7. I also think there's probably something going on for those current year 7s going into year 8 who haven't had done a full year in school, and so they've only had half a year in school, and so going into year they haven't properly settled. It takes them a full year really to settle into secondary school. They're worried about falling behind. The lockdown means they haven't done enough work and they won't be up to speed with when they go back to school. And particularly for older ones, they're worried about home learning on exams and the impact of it on exams. Some of them have really enjoyed being at home and have enjoyed their home learning. Like there's a quote there: "I like to be at home. Home is where I'm at my best and best feel myself." And she can learn. This young lady is saying she can learn at her own pace and structure the learning day. So they're worried about going back to school and what impact about having pressure back on in being in school. A lot of young people find it's quite high pressure, and being at home has actually made it a little bit easier for them. I love this quote because they are worried about what impact it has with seeing school. The younger ones are worried about friendships changing, and the one up in the top right hand corner, that school will be coming back, anxiety of social pressures and beauty standards will return to normal. I mean, that really speaks volumes, I think, about about not just education and about the learning, but actually the rest of the pressures and social pressures that children and young people feel today. And then obviously things around COVID. People are worried, children are worried about going into school, picking up the virus and taking it home to their families, and is it safe? Children with SEND and issues over hygiene and germs and fear of those, are, excessive sort of OCD type activity behaviours, are really worried about going back into that school environment with that fear of germs as well. So that's kind of exacerbates that conditions that they already have. So just really, I think that kind of sums it up. Social distancing, all of those things are really, really worrying and playing on children's minds, and probably playing on parents' minds and teachers' minds as well, for all of us. But I just think it does just give a real sort of insight into what our children and young people are thinking at the moment, and we just can't assume that we know unless we've asked them. So we hope this will be useful for everybody.
Thank you, Jo. I mean, you've done another report, haven't you, for the under fives experience?
Yes.
And there's one to come for children with special educational needs.
Yes.
How do people get those? Can we give a link to that, or?
We can, yes. I mean, they're on our website, and yes, we can. I can put a link through to them.
Into the chat,
I'll try and put it in the chat.
Or we can ask Jo
or we can send it afterwards. Yeah.
But I think one of the things you pointed out is the transition, and actually that's one of the key words, I think, isn't it, Phil and Jo, around anxiety, that that at each stage. And one of the questions we had before from Ruth, who's a learning support assistant, was, do we have any thoughts on pupils transitioning from infant to junior school? And are there any pathways to ease that process? I guess that issue of transitions, one of the things that I was thinking in terms of today's seminar is that, even without COVID, a transition is a big thing for a child, isn't it? And the meaning of a transition for each child is different. So going back into school on the first day in September for some children will bring up the same sort of anxieties they've always had. For others, they weren't particularly anxious, but there might be particular upset or bereavement during lockdown that's going to make it more difficult for them. And so it's the meaning for each child, isn't it, that will have to be taken into account. But in a sense, the main thing around transition is that we're taking it seriously. And of course, by being on this call, everybody is. It's we're preaching to the converted. It's important. But how do we really accept and allow that? And that's the first stage, I think, with anxiety. It's recognizing that to feel worried or anxious is a really ordinary human experience. And at this time, most of us have times of feeling anxious or really anxious. And so, of course, our children do. And that's really understandable. And how do we hear and listen what they've got to say? And take it seriously. You're on mute.
It's making me think, Kathryn, and you're rightly sort of highlighting that every young person, and actually their carers, their teachers, their parents, may understandably be feeling anxious. And so what that's making me think is we're not trying to say at all that this all has to be about serious mental health issues, because anxiety is common. But some of the questions that I sometimes have been asked is what about that more sort of worrying, serious end? Because we wouldn't normally expect nursery school children or primary school children, relatively speaking, to have lots of severe mental illness. But in the young people I see, which are typically sort of 11 plus, actually, anxiety with a capital A, that can be debilitating, low mood and depression and self-harm, may have been present before coronavirus, and actually the current state, of all our households and our country has maybe not affected that in any particular way. So the transition coming back in will be, what do I do, to get support? And I think it's hard to give a one size fits all, but I think that curiosity is a good place to start from. And
Mm,
actually, when we do meet our children, or take our children into the school gate, and teachers meet with them, is actually just to be curious and to maybe spend a bit of time at the beginning of the school year creating a sort of fun, safe environment in which, maybe through play or social activities, the children, and actually the staff, to be honest, can get to know each other quite well, rather than what could be the temptation is to rush into a whole set of
mm,
academic type outcomes,
yes.
which really um, isn't the isn't the real issue here. The real issue is, how do we create and enable safe learning environments, whether at home or at school. So that was what was going through my mind, and I don't know whether people on the call, have got reflections about that.
Mm, mm. Yes. Well, it would be great if people could share it in the chat, and we can share this. There's a quote here from Tracy. Tracy says, "I wonder if the issue for schools will be about how much time they have to talk about worries and anxieties, stacked up against how quickly they need to get children back to learning and academic progress." And I guess that makes me, I mean, there are two things I'd like to say about that. One is that we really know from research that the happier and more settled and more emotionally healthy and confident a child is, the more easily they will learn academically. So putting time into those foundation stones is what brings later and current educational attainment. So how do we as a community be confident in supporting you in the if you're in the schools yourself, um, and parents, to say it's okay. We can't rush this process of managing all the feelings that our children and us as parents might have. That there is no time scale for this, is there? It's going to take the time it takes. And the second thing I was thinking in relation to that is what we also know from research, that children are emotionally healthy when the adults involved in their lives have good, trusting relationships. That is really key. It plays out in research, and you know it yourself as a parent or a teacher or a different professional yourself. If we are helping our children and the children in school settings or in our families to know that the adults are trusting each other, that will help the children. So that brings me, Phil, actually to a couple of the other questions that we had before, which I could read out, which are about parents. How can we support parents to manage their own anxiety about sending their children back to school? That comes from Molly, and also from Nicola. Will you cover support for anxious parents, as this can often be where it starts? Um,
And I'm also conscious that Tracy has put her hand up in the chat. So I'm wondering whether, Tracy, if that's an old hand in relation to your comment earlier, then hopefully we're starting to think about that. But if there's an additional question, if you put that in the chat, then we
mm,
will factor that in.
mm,
Um, so no, those are good. Those are good questions. So I think if I think at a system level, um, Kathryn, I, Joe, and all our colleagues, across Surrey, and with many of you on the call, are trying to make sure that what we strike the right balance is giving a framework to our school settings, primary and secondary, that is flexible enough that actually we're not trying to dictate to schools and to year groups exactly what support should look like. So enough flexibility, but not so vague that actually then people just don't feel supported and contained. So, a good example of what we're trying to do is, we know that there's a lot of work happening, involving the local authority, and schools around, social distancing measures, around what the induction days might look like at the beginning of the new term. Um, We know that inset days, are being targeted to specifically continue, conversations around what support should look like. Obviously, Kathryn referenced that, our first and second webinars were prompted primarily by a letter that we wrote to the wider system, talking about the sorts of supports that are available. And of course, Joe, Cooks today joining us is evidence of how we're trying to make sure that our voluntary sector partners are involved in those conversations and the implementation of that. So there are those things at a system level. I think when it comes down to individual children, we're very conscious that we have, primary mental health workers working in lots of settings. We have other school-based practitioners. We have family support workers in some areas. We have Senkos. We have educational psychologists. And we know that there is a lot of work going on in the background in relation to specific schools and actually specific children over this period. So it speaks to me of, obviously we want your feedback as to how that's going, and I'd forgotten to mention that there will be a feedback form that takes about a minute or so that we're going to include in the chat here, because any things that are going well or not so well, by all means do let us know, and we can try and influence those conversations. But it is a balance between, as I say, school focused interventions and then individual interventions, and then where escalation is needed. Say, for example, if I see people with anxiety, depression, self-harm, is actually we have a single point of access that can be contacted in relation to either gaining support or tracking what support and intervention might look like. And there is an equivalent one for the local authority too. So just some orientating principles, I think, from me. Kathryn and Joe, any thoughts you've got in addition?
I was actually just going to say, Phil, just about something that was put in the comments. I think Debbie commented on the fact that her friend's child, who normally is, well balanced, and I just wanted to pick up on that actually, because we have found that, and we have heard that children who normally thrive are struggling, and vice versa, and that children who previously have really struggled and maybe been school refusers, or have just found the school environment difficult, have actually thrived during lockdown because they haven't had to go to school and they've been able to learn in their own way, in their own time. And so I think that it's really important to be aware of, when we go back to school, of those children and young people who may previously have been well balanced and fared well and have gone under the radar previously, that actually they may be finding it difficult, and so that it may not be the usual suspects. It may not be that there may be those who have been vulnerable before and have found things difficult and are still finding them difficult, but some of them may be actually doing better, but others who we've never really had to take support before are in need of some additional hand holding and a bit of additional support. So just wanted to raise that.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to share a thought, firstly about a couple of families who have talked to me about their experience, and then perhaps just a first tip, if you like, which links to all the things in the chat. And as Phil and I said, we're not here trying to say that we know exactly the way to do it, because there is no right way, is there? But we'd like to share some ideas from our experience. So I'd like to share a thought with you. So firstly, these two families who had a very different experience, a bit like Joe said, we all have such a different experience. And I think if that's one takeaway from this call for all of us, and for me to remind myself that every child's experience is different. And that's, if we remember that, we're really more likely to listen and not make assumptions, I guess, are we? So one family who actually lockdown has meant that they have discovered things about their daughter that they didn't know because they've had more time. They were lucky in that way. Some parents have not had more time with their children because of work and worries, but this family have had more, and they've understood more her needs, her anxiety, and realised that she probably has autism spectrum, and it's led them to, because one of the parents is a key worker, she's been able to go into school to a very small group, so the teachers have got to know her better. And so when she goes back in September, she actually has a situation where the school know her better, the parents understand her needs in a different way, and that's been a very positive experience, actually. Now, of course, it's going to take some work around the planning for her in a bigger group again, but they're doing that work. You know, that work is on the way in a different way than it was 6 months ago. Compare that to another family who actually there had been a trauma in the family. Someone had been very ill, not COVID related, some months back. And this boy had become quite violent through his anxiety, it seemed. Being at home, a lot less violent towards his parents, but the anxiety has become more obvious. And actually, it's made the parents more worried about him. Now, in a way, that's not a bad thing, though, is it? Because it means that they're going to approach the school in a slightly different way as well, in terms of saying, we've kind of understood that our son's got needs that I'm not sure we were meeting. He seemed to be okay, but he's not. And that's not just about COVID, actually. So I just wanted to share those two families with you. Now, in terms of just a thought about what structure might you use? And there are many, there's the recovery curriculum, there are lots of things within Surrey, different resources. And if you know about them, and I know many of you will because of all the different, the wealth of experience on this call, please share them in the chat, and we're happy to then share them, you know, with everybody. But in terms of a structure, a simple structure, I was thinking about it this morning in terms of 4 Ps. So the first P was involving parents. I think a lot of voluntary sector organisations that I've talked to have said it's been really interesting that we've actually worked with parents more than we used to, because to get to the children and young people, of course, that's the connection more. And they've really enjoyed that opportunity. So involve parents, find out what have you learned about your child during lockdown. How can we manage the transition for your child? The second P is predict, because actually with that information from parents and also from what you might know about that child, maybe you can predict at least some of the children who might have difficulty. And it might be because you know of ACEs they already have in their history, adverse childhood experiences you already know about in that family, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's other conflict, maternal mental illness, all the things you might know means that we can predict. So involving parents, predict. As Joe said, we can't predict all, but some we really can. My third P was plan. And I think this was partly also in relation to, we had one question from Abby saying, can you give some advice on people with ASD, ADHD? And there was another question as well around children with ASD. Planning, though, is good for all of us, but particularly children with autism, isn't it? To really make a very clear plan. And at the beginning of this call, I invited you to think about what do you do with your anxiety? And I think, certainly I know for myself, it helps, it's quite containing to make a plan, even if it's a day plan. So can you make a plan, even if it's a day long with a family, about this is what we're going to try today in terms of the transition. This is what we'll try for a week. Then we can look again and see where we're at with it. So involving parents, predicting, planning. The plan, again, those of you who work already with children with special educational needs, you will know that a visual plan can be so helpful for children, can't it? Really clear, simple plan of what the day is holding. And in fact, all children will benefit from that. I think all of us would actually, wouldn't we, really? Just tell us what's happening. And then the fourth P is pause. Take a moment then to pause and reflect, maybe as with your peers in whatever setting you're in. Is this working for this child or not? Should we change it for tomorrow? I'll stop talking for a moment, Phil, but over to you, just with that thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good way of trying to remind ourselves of some of the sort of principles, basic principles that actually, if we can implement ourselves and actually model to our colleagues, because I'm always I'm always curious about the people who are not joining us on this call, and it may be that actually they don't know about it, or that people on the call are representing a wider group of people out there. So it makes me think about how schools are communities, and it needs good leadership from head teachers, senkos. But actually, sometimes the most effective things to put in place are the simple ones. And I think that 4P mnemonic is a really good one. Um, I'm just curious again, probably in line with where most of my work focuses on, is around some of the more serious mental health issues. And I just really wanted to flag up one particular area that we are very mindful of. And I know some people on the call will have direct experience of this. We know that there is a heightened association between anxiety, mood disorders, suicidality, and people who have autism or ADHD. And we know that, unfortunately, in recent months there have been some clusters of kids, where self-harm and suicidal thinking have been a distinct part. So I want to name that because actually just naming something can mean not that we're paralyzed by it, but actually we are mindful of that in some of our conversations. So with one or two school teachers, they've been asking me recently, Phil, what do I do if somebody says to me, that I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling, like I don't want to live my life anymore. And again, I tend to want to break it down simply. So I think the first thing is to listen to that, and in an open way. So it may be that you have to, you know, briefly acknowledge it, because sometimes kids can come to you, in the middle of a lesson, and maybe go and say, I'm hearing that. I wonder if at the end of the lesson we can spend 5 or so minutes. So if you're going to promise something like that, then do that, because even in itself it will be containing for the child. And then, of course, you can always supplement that by a longer conversation, perhaps, over school break or at the end of the day. Now, of course, each of us will feel more or less comfortable about those sorts of conversations. So I would strongly recommend that, we say it, don't we? A problem shared is a problem halved. If there is a young person um, where concerns are emerging, actually discuss it with the head of year, or discuss it with the Senko or the deputy head, or whoever, in fact, because each of us in our work settings will have go-to people that help us think clearly about what to do next. And again, that in itself can mean that a plan or a way of thinking can be delivered, locally, and actually always be mindful to go at the pace of the child. I think sometimes, we spoke about this on a previous webinar, sometimes the temptation for all of us can be about, well, I've got to make a referral to Phil and his colleagues in CAMS. In fact, actually, at any given point in time, that might be completely the wrong thing to do. So it is about having a conversation and going at the pace of the child, and ideally the carers, be they the parents or somebody who's acting in a parental role. Um, and then, of course, the letter that is being referenced in the chat, gives, and will be recirculated to everybody on this call, gives specifics about, how that sort of conversation can be supported from people like myself or my colleagues in CAMS, or, if a younger child, typically, from colleagues that work with Kathryn, and others in our paediatric services. So I just wanted to name that, and obviously people feel free to comment on that, or question us further about that particular side of things. Joe, I wonder if you've got any um, additional sort of thoughts at the moment. Thank you for sharing some more of your work in the chat.
Oh, that's a pleasure. As I say, there's another report coming out in the next week or so, which is about SEND, which is absolutely fascinating. Actually, it's been a real privilege to work on that one. And thanks to Family Voice, you've also posted in the chat. I know they're running some virtual coffee sessions, I think, particularly for parents and carers who with children with SEND, to help them with anxiety. and the return to school, which I think will be really useful for a lot of parents. I just think there is, I think there needs to be a lot of focus on supporting the parents. Actually, there's lots that can be done, and I know that Kathryn's put some stuff in our Facebook page about how can we support parents in the run up to the return to school. And there are some really good resources actually that I'm sure will have already been shared in the letter, and I know they're on the Facebook page about what parents can do in the run up to returning to school, to prepare their children for that. And I think I completely agree with you around those who've got more serious issues, and around self-harm and just about reaching out and listening. And I was on a call yesterday where we were talking about peer support actually, because children don't always go to a trusted adult. Whether it's a parent or a teacher, they sometimes go to their friends, and so there are friends who are on suicide watch, for their friends, and it's about how can we make sure that those children and young people are being supported and know where to go. I think it's the perennial question, isn't it? Where do you go for help? And you don't ever access it until you're in crisis. You don't go looking for help just in case I need it further down the line. You only look for it when you need it. So having the information that you've already provided, that letter with all those resources is really helpful. And it's about making sure that we share it widely and share it with our young people, and to make sure and encourage our parents to share it with their children as well. I know that I'm guilty of it. I receive stuff from my children's school and then don't pass it on to them, whereas actually I've got an inbox full of resources to support my children's mental health, and I haven't quite passed it on to my children, so it's a note for myself actually. So to make sure that we do that.
Yeah, you're making me think actually, Joe, you're almost encouraging us all to be a bit braver about, how we support, the parents. And I'm minded, on the call, we've got representatives from Family Voice who we're starting to do, additional strands of work with around, those Zoom support sessions to family. I'm very mindful of our CAMS Youth Advisor work with Olivia and others. And actually, I would probably, I would be so bold as to suggest that if you've got a gut feeling, in your place of work, supporting a family, that you think that the adults, the parents, might have some significant mental health issues, I would take a risk and try and name it. I would name that, that gut feeling. So often what I will do is I will sort of say, look, I've noticed actually how worrying, the situation is for you. I'm wondering about, and then I will look to the parents, and you might be able to do this at the school gate or in a review meeting. Look to the parents and specifically say, look, how do you get your support? And if there are two parents, you might go and say to them, how do you support one another? And then, depending on how that goes, you might then go and say, well, actually, that seems great, but what if you both struggle? What might you do? Now, of course, for some people, they will know that they've got particular anxiety issues, depression issues. For some, they won't. And actually, that little intervention or part of a series of little nudging conversations could be really impactful, because what we know is that for a whole range of conditions, in fact most conditions, physical and psychological, that where there is family history in close family members of illness, that actually that's a risk factor for young people. And of course what we're in the business of is doing quite a complicated thing, is supporting young people and trying to address their needs at the earliest possible time, so preventing in severe and enduring mental illness, but at the same time helping support the parents who spend most of the time with them. So it's a dual task, but maybe something of what I've suggested could be an encouragement to you to keep up that sort of good work that we know you do with families in all the settings that you're at.
Maybe
Kathryn,
I could, shall I come in? I was just thinking of, there's the aspect of peer support. Joe, I'm so glad you pointed out about children, and maybe it's something that we could all explicitly think about talking to classes of children about, you know, if you're supporting another child, here's where you might get some support. I think that's a really important group. There's the parent support and enabling parents to say, actually, I'm having an awful time, because we're not going to be shocked and because we can bear to hear it. So one of the things that I always remember, is one of the first child psychiatry trainers I had when I was training was saying to me, you know, the more you can show a child or a parent that you can bear to hear what they're going to tell you, the more likely they will tell you things. And I don't know about people on the call, but you may well relate to that, that the more well, the older and grayer we get, some call it more wisdom, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, the more that people will tell us. You know, people tell me things now that they wouldn't have told me when I was 20 or 30. It does change, but partly it's through not being shocked and knowing that it's okay to tell somebody something, isn't it? I was also thinking, while we're on the issue of support, that a key thing I wanted to mention in this is that what support do you get, each of you on this call? And, you know, take a moment, and you may be good at thinking about that, but a lot of us are not very good at it. Who do you go to for support? What do you know gives you space to reflect? Have you booked some time off this summer? If not, book some time. If you know, if you're struggling with loss, bereavement, ill health yourself, how can you make space to really get the help you need too? It's so important, isn't it, Phil and Joe? And you know, all of you I know will feel that. How do we let somebody know and get support ourselves? Because we can't do this job of supporting children and families as easily if we're struggling, you know, with a lot ourselves without help. I was just wondering, Phil, whether I might take a couple of minutes to answer the kind of question of what do we do in another way. And I wondered, Joe Patel, whether you could put up that cartoon that I've given you as a way of thinking about what do you do when you have a child or parent that you're wanting to find a way of supporting or listening to. And I think the first thing, and I mean, it relates to what Phil said about, all right, here it is. So I'll talk you through the cartoon and then I'll say a bit more. So this cartoon is called The Mouse and the Pig. And there are 4 pictures. In the first picture, you can see Mouse in the rain, in the fog, in the dark, and his friend Pig is standing outside, watching, having a look, seeing that her friend is really not in a good place. And in the second picture, Mouse is saying to his friend, "Ever have one of those days?" And then in the third one, you can see Pig has thought about this and is walking towards her friend and walks in to the rain, into the cloud, and stands next to her friend and says, "What are friends for?" And the reason I really love this cartoon and thought about it this morning is because the temptation for all of us, whether it's personally or professionally, is to try to take someone out of the rain cloud to where we are in the sunshine. Because actually, partly it's really hard to go in the rain when we don't want to. We want to stay in the sun. But actually, our children, our friends, our colleagues, especially at times like this when there is grief, there is pain, there is upset, we can't just make it better by saying, "Come on, come in the sunshine." We actually have to get the support and the courage around us to mean that we can stand in the rain with a child or with a parent and be with them. In a particular way of thinking about parenting, it's this phrase used in different ways in lots of different parenting programs, but it's being with. We need to be with children. We need to be with our child. We need to be with someone who's in pain. And we can't just say, just feel better. It doesn't work like that. Sometimes it means being alongside and accompanying. And actually, like that phrase Phil shared, a problem shared is a problem halved. It doesn't always feel like that, does it? But actually, when we share someone's feelings, or when we listen and accept them and let them know that even very powerful feelings of fury or anger or upset, or however feelings come out, because of course children's feelings don't always come out the way that we want them to come out or the way we're expecting. But if we can accept them, then they will feel a lot better about themselves and a lot less alone. And then we can begin then to help them to organize their feelings, make sense of their feelings, simply by having named them and been able to share them. So yeah, do share any thoughts on the chat about that, or yeah, any other thoughts around that, really. Yeah.
I've been looking at the chat. We've got about 7 minutes or so, and we are going to finish promptly on the hour. A couple of really helpful points there that I just want to clarify. So somebody raised the point about when not to refer if somebody has got suicidal thoughts or feelings. I guess maybe I didn't really make myself as clear as I might be. The bottom line is look, if the right thing feels to make a referral, and you've got the consent of the child and the family, then of course make a referral, and that can be a sort of in-house referral in a school setting, or it can be a consultation request with a primary mental health worker, or it could be a referral into our single point of access. Because absolutely what we don't want to do, and maybe that was what the question was alluding to in the chat, is make people sit with unbearable levels of anxiety, because actually that will massively impact on your ability to work and function, and actually you're more likely to take all that sort of stuff back home, and have an impact there. So I hope I'm clarifying what I'm trying to say. And then there was another question that I think is a really key one, which I'll just touch on briefly, which is around, refusal to go to school refusal. The temptation pre-coronavirus can often be to think that school refusal is a sort of psychological illness, and in fact and therefore needs treatment and intervention. What we know is that most school refusal is not that. It's normally about things such as a worry that the child has about how mum or dad are at home. And of course we know in its worst instances, we know that nationally coronavirus has resulted in an increase in safeguarding referrals, and also in an increase in domestic violence referrals, because at the risk of, I don't want to make it too simplistic, is actually when we're all living in confined spaces with people all of the time, then that just exacerbates problems that could do with being addressed. So most school refusal is around what's going on for the child that means that they'd far rather be at home. And if we can get to that, then actually we stand a chance of bringing a child in to school, and that not being their coping mechanism. Now, sometimes people will ask me, well, Phil, how do we get them back into school? Well, I think, again, it's not about a right or a wrong answer. What we all know, and what we all need to encourage families and children, is for the vast majority of them, coming into school has lots of benefits: social benefits, educational benefits, support benefits. Yes, we do know that there is a group of kids who are being homeschooled, and how they might be supported. So the challenges around having a conversation that talks perhaps about a gradual reintroduction into school, half a day, then 1 day, maybe anchored around, um, subjects that that young person we know enjoys, or particular teachers that they really like and trust. And again, using a gradual approach and conversations to inform the pacing as well as the timetabling, usually is the best way. It usually doesn't work well to go and have a conversation with a child that invariably boils down to, you're going into school whether you like it or not, go into school, and then you have outbursts. And of course, the amount of work that we can do in advance of the new term actually will help in terms of preparing young people and ourselves actually for, you know what, we're all going to be expected more so to be back at work, back at school, and actually still attending to our anxieties along the way.
I mean, I just wanted to link to that, Phil. I completely agree. And if there are ways that any of us can support any of you as our colleagues around having the confidence to go at the pace of a particular child and family, then we're really up for that, aren't we, Phil? You know, it's that's how you build a child's emotional health and resilience going forward. Rushing them isn't going to work. And I can see in the comments, of course, there's the issue around what the government's asking for or what the school's trying to make happen, but how do we really put the child and family at the centre of this? And one thought that I have is, of course, there's often no magic bullet. It's about being creative and thinking, how will this child know that we're really interested in them? And in terms of all the children, how do we find out what's it been like for you being at home? Because we won't know, you know. And to ask parents, maybe it might be that you want to meet with parents in some form, either before or pretty soon, as in, what's it been like? Have you lost anyone? Have you had illness? Has something else happened completely not to do with COVID that it would be good for us to know, so that we know what life's like for each child in our class, and that we can think about, you know, depending on the culture of your school. I mean, I have an anthropology background, so the word ritual comes to my mind. But you know, a ritual, a way of marking, a way of talking about what's happened as the months go on. Yeah.
We're in the last minute or so, so I'm going to bring things to a conclusion. Just a couple of things by means of signing off, at least for now, is please everybody do complete the form that's in the chat in terms of feedback, because we do want to learn from this experience, this shared experience with you. And I guess also to sort of say, you know, over the coming remaining weeks of the holidays, you know, do take care of yourselves, but also be mindful that actually in September we are thinking about how to build on these webinars, you know, in terms of topics, in terms of target areas. So do include any thoughts you may have in the feedback form. And we all hope, so from Joe, from Kathryn and myself, we hope to catch up with you soon, either in person or in your settings over the coming days, weeks and months. So take care and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.